In my experience, when I'm talking to someone about collapsed foot arches or flat feet, they're usually referring to the foot itself as the problem. But in reality, that's where the problem is just showing up, and it's a much larger picture than that. I'm going to be focusing on the mechanical factors of flat feet and influences we actually have control over. I very much believe that there is a genetic influence on the presentation of someone's foot visually, but we're going to set that aside because I think that that's not something we have a lot of control over. I would also like to say that flat feet are not inherently a problem. As we will see soon, it can actually be beneficial in certain contexts. But we're also going to focus on the fact that these flat feet could be associated and representing certain limitations that people have and can address. Pronation of the foot is paired with internal rotation up the chain at both the pelvis and the femur and also the tibia or shin. This occurs during mid-stance phase of gait. When we strike the ground with the outside of our heel, we move onto the inside edge of our foot arch, and we do this after heel strike. So we strike with our heel in an externally rotated position of our pelvis, feeding down the leg into external rotation of this tibia right here. Once we start to really load our body weight over that stance leg side, the foot arch is going to go down, and this is being paired with internal rotation at the hip and internal rotation feeding down into this tibia right here, which creates this joint action right here. And this is actually a relative motion and a dissociation between the rear foot and the forefoot. Now, the foot is incredibly complex, but to keep things simple for this video, when this tibial internal rotation occurs, what you're going to see at the rear foot is you're going to see eversion. So you're going to see the subtalar joint move, and you're going to see this bone go in like this. At the forefoot, you're going to get relative amounts of inversion, so it's going to do the opposite. That means that as this goes in, this right here, this forefoot, is going to move out like so, and that's what creates that joint action of pronation, which is coupled with dorsiflexion of the ankle. So to summarize, we have internal rotation at the lower body, and that's going to be paired with this shin moving forward into dorsiflexion, and that's tibial internal rotation, which is going to result in that relative motion of pronation. When we are in pronation and mid-stance, that flattens out the arch to a relative extent, which is going to stretch the soft tissues on the bottom side of the foot, which allow it to then re-spring that arch back up upon mid-stance and push-off. Almost every single time someone presents with collapsed arches or flat feet, they are missing some degree of internal rotation at either the hip, but also potentially the tibia as well. Now, internal rotation is so essential because internal rotation represents force going into the ground. When we're walking, remember that there's an equal and opposite reaction happening according to the laws of physics. So as I take a step and put my foot on the ground, I have to deal with the ground reaction forces and start immediately moving towards a position of internal rotation so I can put force into the ground to remain upright. Otherwise, I will just collapse into the ground because I have nothing holding myself up, and we need internal rotation for that. So the point is we're going to find a way to create that internal rotation if we're missing it somewhere. And the easiest way we can do that in many cases is to go into an anterior pelvic tilt or orientation of the hips. Normal hip internal rotation involves these innominate bones going in, which creates space for these femurs to rotate in, and then that feeds down the chain into tibial internal rotation, and that also allows for better pronation of the foot as this tibia internally rotates. However, if I don't have internal rotation, what I can actually do is I can just push my pelvis forward as a whole unit, and that's going to bias my femur into internal rotation. When people have pain or potentially significant movement limitations that could be associated with flat feet, a very, very common presentation that I see is a tibia that is externally rotated relative to a femur that is internally rotated. And this occurs for several different reasons, but the gist of it is the more forward our pelvis gets pushed in an orientation or an anterior pelvic tilt, then the more this tibia tends to turn out into external rotation relative to this femur. So what you see is this offset gets created. This goes in, this moves out like this, and this patella or kneecap gets pulled to the side. In many of these cases, when someone has a lot of tibial external rotation, and you were to draw a line from the plateau of that tibia right there, or the bottom of that kneecap, it would go significantly off to the side. However, in standing, we still need to be able to keep our foot underneath our hip to a certain extent. So the only way this is really possible is if I have this bone going out to the side a lot, it's going to literally bend and create a little bit of a twist as we go down into this distal or further part of the tibia here. And yes, bones can and do twist. It just occurs over a long period of time, depending on a couple of factors. If you don't believe me, you can literally see this in some people on a day-to-day basis. And it's all a gradient. So some people have more, some people have less. But the point is that this external rotation proximally and this bending creates an internal rotation position down at the bottom of this tibia right here. So what you end up seeing is as this gets bent in, the pressure goes down and this foot can collapse down further. Two of the most simple tests that I use to determine if someone has a restriction is to use just basic femoral internal rotation. And if someone has less than about 25 to 30 degrees, then I know that there's probably a significant limitation there. We can also use supine knee flexion. And if someone can't get their heel towards their butt all the way, then I know that that person has a limitation in tibial internal rotation. Now keep in mind, someone could have terrible range of motion, but still flat feet are not a problem for them because they won't have pain or significant movement restrictions preventing them from whatever their task or sport-specific goals are. In fact, it could be helpful. If you look at so many high-level athletes' feet, they're oftentimes pretty unaesthetically pleasing and they're often collapsed down into the floor. Now this could be helpful for them because if you remember what happens when we go into pronation, we are in maximum internal rotation. And as that foot goes into more pronation, it stretches out the soft tissues on the bottom of the foot so that it can spring up for push-off. And depending on the person, that could potentially also allow them to access that windlass mechanism more quickly and push off and respring relative to their foot. However, if you do have problems and you suspect it could be associated with flat feet, then there's a couple of steps we need to take after we determine where the area of restriction is. If someone has a lack of hip internal rotation, they're very likely pushed forward into an anterior orientation of their pelvis, and we need to be able to bring that back and be able to re-educate better internal rotation without them needing to go into extension in order to do that. Because the more I go into extension, the more my center of mass gets pushed forward onto my midfoot and forefoot, and that can result in me having more of a collapsed arch as well. A basic activity we can use for this is a hook-lying hamstring bridge to help pull the pelvis back with the hamstrings and start to get some internal rotation working with that. If you want to see the full walkthroughs of all of these videos with tons of instruction and also common mistakes, check out the article I'm writing alongside this in the description below. One of my all-time favorite activities for someone that has a limitation in hip internal rotation and has flat feet is to use a ramp where they're just laying on it and they're in a specific position which is allowing them to push that femur back into internal rotation. This can be a very effective tactic to get big range of motion gains for people that do have flat feet. And you're going to see why this works in a second, but what we need first is to set up a ramp that's about this much of a slant. And you can do this with books. We have about 2 to 3-ish inch thick books on both sides right here. And they're about a foot length away from each other. And we have another book stacked on top. And again, it doesn't matter too much how thick these ones are in particular, but they should be hardcover so that way you can have something to reference your hip against. So now we're going to start Trevor in what we call a low oblique sit position, where he has his hip on one, the downside, and his elbow is going to be on the other slant. And we're going to have this leg straight out in front, the knee's going to be bent at about 90-ish degrees, and then we're going to have this leg, this foot in particular, up against the front shin here. And we got to make sure that we just feel like we are on this outside bone of our hip on this downside, and the inner part of the elbow is flat on this side right here. Now all we're going to do is we're going to gently, very gently and subtly reach this knee forward, keeping the whole foot flat here, taking the arm, reaching it very slightly forward at the same angle of what this knee is reaching forward with, and we're just going to sit here and hang out. As this knee goes very slightly forward, you might feel a little pressure of that bone going into the ramp on that downside hip right there, and that's good. It doesn't feel like much. You're not feeling any muscle activate. You're just kind of sitting here, and what this ramp is doing is allowing us to push the femur back into the hip socket to improve internal rotation. Now I'm giving you several different examples that can give you a really great start and can work really well, but it's not going to give you the full picture because that's beyond the scope of this video. If you're looking for more of an in-depth program that addresses a ton of lower limb issues, then check out my Lower Limb Foundations program. If my goal is to improve tibial internal rotation, then I can use a self-mobilization roll, which is in that article down below, Or you can also use a position like this that's going to help you drive that internal rotation at the upper part of the tibia that many people don't have. To set up, we have a yoga block underneath the opposite hand of the foot that is forward here for this first option. And then we're going to put our other hand just off to the side, chilling, hanging out. And what we need to do here is get about a 90-ish degree bend in the knee to start. And as we fold over here to put our hand on the yoga block, we're gonna feel a stretch in this back hip. So we need to feel 3 points of contact throughout this entire exercise. The first metatarsal head right here, the fifth metatarsal head, which is the pinky toe, and then the inner heel right here. So we're never gonna lose them, but we're gonna focus on the first met head right here and the inner heel. Now, in this position where we're kind of slouched over, feeling that back hip capsule, we're going to focus on pronating the foot, pushing the knee slightly forward, and now we're going to push the knee slightly out without losing that first met head and the inner heel. And we shouldn't have our toes go white. We shouldn't feel like we're too far forward on our toes. We should feel like we're really evenly distributing that weight between the inner heel and first met head. These toes are completely relaxed, hanging out. And we're going to sit here and breathe and relax in this position. You should feel a lot of glute max on the same side of the foot that's on the ground. With any of these exercises, I encourage you to take those two assessments, your internal rotation of your hip and also at your tibia with the supine knee flexion, and then retest yourself after doing these exercises properly. If you do, the chances are high you're going to see that these things start to feel a little bit better. Now, after I get internal rotation back, I want to be able to properly couple that internal rotation with dorsiflexion and pronation of the foot, and I want to re-educate better pronation mechanics. I want to help drive that tibial internal rotation with rear foot eversion and forefoot inversion. And one way I like to do that is with wedges. Usually after the wedges, I progress them off of those into more of an unassisted position where they are doing this specific pronation drill. And I encourage you to really pay attention to the cues here because a lot of people butcher these mobilizations.
To set up for this activity, you're gonna have your feet staggered apart and something to hold on to if you need that rack support. The stagger is going to be about 1 foot length between his rear toe and his heel. To start out, we want Connor's shin to be plantar flexed, where he has this greater angle between his foot and his tibia. That's going to allow him to move from a place of external rotation into a place of internal rotation as he goes through this pronation drill. What we want to focus on feeling starting out is the outside edge of that heel, his knuckle of the big toe and knuckle of the pinky toe. We don't want his toes to be changing color like he's gripping the ground or he has a lot of weight in that forefoot to start out. We want to really be back on that heel. So to initiate this, what Connor's going to do is he's going to turn his hip of the leg that is forward with him. And what that's going to do is it's going to drive the knee forward. It's going to move his weight from the outside edge of this foot towards the inside edge of that heel or his calcaneus and onto the inside ball of that forefoot. And we still want to make sure you can sense his heel throughout this motion. The goal isn't to lose that heel reference or have that heel pop off the ground if this is my heel right here. We want to see pronation of the foot coming down the chain from initiating with that hip. The most common mistake on this drill is people are going to want to press their toes into the ground. Not that knuckle of the big toe, but the toes themselves. So something I might do is when Connor's in this starting position, I might cue him to lift all his toes off the ground, feel those knuckles of the toes with weight, and then gently put his toes back down to feel what it's like to have them unweighted for reference. The other most common mistake is people aren't going to start with this plantar flex shin and with their weight more on the outside edge of that heel, which is more symbolic of what we're going to see in something like heel strike.
Now, for other people, they actually do need a little bit of help with Shoewear. I have a full video on that I just released last week, and that could be a very helpful complement to the concepts I'm discussing within this video. Now, when I'm coaching someone in my gym and they're doing weighted exercises or activities that require them to go into dynamic pronation and then back into supination, then I want them to be able to maintain the foot contacts of that famous tripod that lots of people hear about. That entails contact at the heel, the first metatarsal head right here, and the lateral or fifth metatarsal head right here. Not the actual toes themselves, they should be staying pretty relaxed, but right here and right here is where we're looking for. And if they can maintain those foot contacts, then they're going to be able to best move through pronation and dorsiflexion to supination and plantar flexion very effectively.